The chill was the first thing that really registered, a sharp, insistent presence against my skin. I'd been knocking on the basement door for a while, my voice already tired from trying to be heard. Down there, on the concrete floor, my fingers had gone completely numb. Above me, I could make out the sounds of laughter, footsteps echoing from the kitchen where everyone else was having dinner. They were eating without me. My name is Emily Jensen, and I was 32 at the time. The person who put me down there, the one who actually secured that door, was my older sister, Sarah. She was 35. Looking back, it felt like she'd always carried a deep-seated resentment toward me. Our mother, Eleanor, had a way of constantly pitting us against each other. Sarah, she got the dazzling personality, the looks, that easy charm. I was the smart one, the one who earned the scholarships and built a successful career. That contrast between us created a chasm, growing deeper with every year that passed. This basement incident, it happened over the Thanksgiving holiday. I'd driven 6 hours from Seattle to our hometown of Rosewood to see my family. My father, David, had been pleading with me to visit more often. He missed me. He said family connections were vital. I should have known better, should have understood things wouldn't be any different this time. Sarah had arrived 2 days before me with her husband, Mark, and their 3 kids. She'd already settled into her role as the cherished daughter, cooking meals and organizing family activities. By the time I walked through the door on Wednesday evening, she was clearly running the household. Eleanor doted on her, praising every little thing as if Sarah had achieved something monumental. The trouble truly began at dinner on Thursday. I made the mistake of mentioning my recent promotion to senior architect at my firm. The table fell silent. Sarah's smile stiffened. Eleanor immediately shifted the conversation, launching into a long story about Sarah volunteering for a school fundraiser. David tried to congratulate me, but Eleanor spoke right over him, her voice rising to drown out his words. Friday morning, Sarah cornered me in the hallway outside my old bedroom. Her eyes were cold, assessing. She suggested we go down to the basement to look through some old photo albums Eleanor wanted organized. I hesitated, but David was nearby and encouraged me, thinking it might help mend our strained relationship. His optimism had always been his Achilles heel. Our childhood home's basement had never been properly finished. Concrete walls, exposed insulation, a dirt floor in the back where the foundation had settled poorly. In November, with night temperatures already dipping below freezing, that basement was dangerously cold. We never heated it. There was no reason to. It was just storage, a place for old Christmas decorations and forgotten furniture. Sarah led me down the wooden stairs, chattering about a story from her youngest daughter's ballet recital. I followed, completely unsuspecting. She opened a box of photos near the old furnace, and I bent down to look. Memories flooded back, birthday parties, summer vacations, school plays. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe this might be a genuine attempt at connection. Then I heard the door slam. The lock clicked into place. I spun around and ran up the stairs, but the heavy wooden door wouldn't budge. Sarah had installed a deadbolt on the outside, something I hadn't noticed on my way down. I started yelling instantly, throwing my shoulder against the wood. My sister's footsteps faded across the floor above. She was humming. For the first hour, I convinced myself someone would notice. David would wonder where I'd gone. Eleanor would need something from storage. Someone would come looking. The second hour, the cold began to seep through my clothes. I'd come downstairs in jeans and a sweater, nothing warm enough for those conditions. The temperature gauge on the wall read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. By hour 4, I'd stopped yelling. My throat felt raw, torn from screaming. I tried my phone, but there was no signal down there. The basement walls were too thick, the location too far below ground. I curled up against the furnace, which offered minimal warmth as it only heated the upper floors. My teeth wouldn't stop chattering. Hour 7 brought serious shaking. My whole body convulsed involuntarily, desperately trying to generate heat that wasn't there. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around myself. The concrete had drained every bit of warmth from my system. I kept thinking about hypothermia, about how people succumb to exposure. Would they find me here? Would anyone even care? Around hour 10, confusion began to set in. My thoughts became foggy, disconnected. I couldn't remember why I was there. Parts of my childhood mixed with current reality, creating bizarre visions. I saw my grandmother, gone for 15 years, sitting in the corner, telling me to rest. Just close your eyes, sweetheart. Everything will be better when you wake up. By hour 14, I'd given up on rescue. Nobody was coming. Sarah had done this deliberately, and Eleanor either hadn't noticed or didn't care that I'd vanished. I thought about my life in Seattle, my apartment overlooking the river, my cat, who would be wondering where I'd gone. My assistant at work, Jessica, would worry when I didn't show up on Monday. But Monday was 3 days away. The trembling stopped by hour 16. My body had given up trying to warm itself. I felt strangely peaceful, detached. The cold didn't hurt anymore. I just felt tired, so incredibly tired. Sleep seemed like the only reasonable option. I let my eyes drift closed. The door opening snapped me partially back to consciousness. David's voice, panicked and broken, calling my name. Hands lifting me, carrying me up the stairs. Bright lights that hurt my eyes. Sirens wailing in the distance. Someone wrapped me in blankets that felt like sandpaper against my frozen skin. I woke up in Rosewood Memorial Hospital. The room was aggressively warm. Heat lamps were positioned around my bed, and fluids dripped into my arm. A woman in a white coat stood at the foot of my bed, studying a chart, deep concern etched on her face. Dr. Susan Reed, her name tag read. She noticed me stirring and moved closer. Her expression was professional but kind, the face of someone who'd witnessed terrible things but hadn't let it harden her completely. She asked how I felt, checked my vitals, explained what had happened to my body during those 18 hours. Severe hypothermia, a core temperature of 89 degrees when paramedics arrived. Another hour, maybe 2, and I wouldn't have survived. Then she asked the question that changed everything: how did you end up locked in that basement? I told her the truth. Every detail, from Sarah's invitation to look at photos to the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, to the hours of screaming that nobody answered. Dr. Reed's face grew darker with each sentence. She excused herself, saying she needed to make some calls. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers entered my room, Detective Amy Lewis and her partner, Officer Kevin Chang. They recorded my statement, asked detailed questions about the timeline and circumstances. Had there been previous incidents with my sister? Yes, I admitted. Years of subtle cruelty, psychological games, systematic undermining. Nothing this extreme, though. Nothing that could have taken my life. Detective Lewis asked about security cameras. My father had installed a system 2 years earlier after a neighborhood break-in. There were cameras covering most of the first floor, including one in the kitchen with a view of the basement door. Could they review that footage? I gave them permission to request it from my father. David provided the footage within hours. He came to my hospital room afterward, his face gray with shock and deep shame. He'd watched the recording, seen Sarah leave me downstairs, then return alone and secure the door behind her. Watched as Eleanor asked where I'd gone, and Sarah casually said, "I drove back to Seattle early because of a work emergency." Observed as the family continued with their day, eating meals, watching television, tucking the kids into bed, while I was left to face potentially fatal consequences in the basement below them. My father wept. He had believed Sarah's lie completely. Never questioned why I would leave without saying goodbye, without my suitcase, without my car that still sat in the driveway. He trusted his eldest daughter, and that trust had nearly cost his youngest her life. the police arrested Sarah that evening. She protested dramatically, claiming it was a misunderstanding, a prank that went too far. Her lawyer argued she'd simply forgotten I was down there, got distracted by her children. The security footage destroyed that defense. The camera clearly showed her checking the basement door multiple times throughout the day, ensuring the lock held. She'd even smiled once, a small, satisfied expression as she tested the deadbolt. Dr. Reed's testimony proved crucial. She explained to the prosecutor exactly how close I'd come to perishing, detailing the permanent harm severe hypothermia can cause. Frostbite had claimed 2 of my toes and parts of 3 fingers. I'd need physical therapy to regain full function in my hands. The psychological impact would take years to process, if I ever fully recovered at all. The charges for a gravely dangerous act came as a shock to everyone except Dr. Reed, who'd seen the deliberate nature of Sarah's actions reflected in my medical condition. Eleanor hired an expensive defense attorney for Sarah, draining her retirement savings. She called me at the hospital, her voice shaking with rage rather than concern. How could I do this to my sister? Sarah has 3 children who need their mother. You're tearing the family apart over an accident. I hung up on her. David showed up an hour later, divorce papers in hand. He'd already filed. After 37 years of marriage, he was done. Watching that security footage had shattered something fundamental in him, revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. Eleanor had known, on some level. She'd chosen not to ask questions, not to investigate. Her favoritism had enabled this extreme act of violence. The months between Sarah's arrest and the trial beginning were a special kind of hell. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from the physical damage. The frostbite had been worse than doctors initially realized. My left foot required surgery to remove the damaged toes, a procedure that left me unable to walk properly for months. Physical therapy sessions were excruciating, forcing blood flow back into tissue that had partially died from the extreme cold. The nightmares started during my hospital stay. Every night, I'd wake up screaming, convinced I was back in that basement. The nurses gave me sleeping medication, but it only made things worse. I'd fall into a deep sleep and experience vivid visions about succumbing to the cold, about my family standing around my frozen form and discussing what to have for dinner. Dr. Reed recommended a psychiatrist, Dr. Lisa Chin, who specialized in trauma cases. Dr. Chin visited me 3 times a week while I was hospitalized. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was post-traumatic stress, a normal response to an abnormal situation. Someone I trusted had tried to end my life, and my brain was struggling to process that betrayal. She warned me that recovery would take years, not months. Some survivors never fully heal from this kind of familial violence. David visited daily, bringing flowers and books, sitting quietly beside my bed. He aged 10 years in those 6 weeks. The guilt consumed him visibly. He lost weight, developed a nervous habit of rubbing his hands together constantly. He told me stories about my childhood that I'd forgotten, moments when he'd noticed Sarah's cruelty but dismissed it as sibling rivalry. The pattern had been there all along, escalating slowly over decades until it reached this life-threatening act. Eleanor came once, exactly once, during my entire hospital stay. She stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, her face twisted with resentment rather than concern. She wanted me to drop the charges. Sarah was suffering in jail, separated from her children, facing public humiliation. Couldn't I see how this was affecting the whole family? The neighbors were talking. Her church friends were asking questions. My stubborn insistence on pressing charges was causing more harm than the actual incident. I stared at her in disbelief. The actual incident. That's what she called 18 hours of deliberate cruelty that nearly took my life. She couldn't even acknowledge what Sarah had done. Couldn't use words like extreme violence or assault. Everything had to be minimized, sanitized, transformed into something manageable that wouldn't threaten her worldview, where Sarah was the golden child who could do no wrong. Dr. Reed entered during Eleanor's visit, took one look at the situation, and ordered my mother to leave. Eleanor protested indignantly, claiming she had every right to visit her daughter. Dr. Reed's response was ice-cold, professional fury. My patient's core temperature was 89 degrees upon admission. Another hour, and we'd be having a very different conversation. If you can't support her recovery, you need to leave immediately. Eleanor left in a huff, and I never saw her in person again. The media attention was overwhelming. Local news picked up the story first, running segments about the Thanksgiving basement ordeal. Then regional outlets grabbed it, followed by national coverage. My hospital room phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews. Hospital security had to post guards outside my door to prevent journalists from sneaking in disguised as medical staff. I gave one interview, carefully coordinated with the prosecutor's office. A reporter named Ashley Morgan from a major network sat beside my hospital bed and asked gentle questions about what happened. I showed her my damaged hands and feet, explained the timeline, described the cold. The segment aired nationally and sparked enormous public interest in the case. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion about family loyalty versus accountability. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Some people insisted I was overreacting, that siblings fight, and this was just an argument that escalated. Others recognized the calculated nature of Sarah's actions and called for maximum sentencing. The comment sections on news articles were vicious battlegrounds where strangers debated whether I deserved sympathy or condemnation for destroying my sister's life. Mark filed for divorce 3 months after Sarah's arrest. He released a public statement through his attorney, expressing horror at his wife's actions and full support for my recovery and the prosecution. He'd hired a private investigator to review the evidence, wanting to understand what kind of person he'd been married to for 12 years. The investigator uncovered a disturbing pattern of escalating violent behavior in Sarah's past. There had been incidents at her previous jobs I'd never known about: a coworker locked in a supply closet during a workplace dispute, a neighbor whose car brakes had mysteriously failed after a property line argument. Nothing provable, nothing that resulted in charges, but a clear pattern of Sarah responding to perceived slights with dangerous acts. Mark was terrified for his children, wondering what she might have done to them eventually if this hadn't happened. The prosecutor assigned to my case was Rachel Miller, a veteran of domestic violence prosecutions who understood family dynamics better than anyone I had met. She spent hours with me preparing my testimony, helping me understand what the defense would argue, coaching me on how to remain composed under cross-examination. Rachel had seen dozens of cases where family members committed terrible violence and then claimed it was accidental or exaggerated. Rachel also helped me understand the civil lawsuit process. Criminal charges would hold Sarah accountable publicly, but a civil suit could provide financial compensation for my injuries and ongoing medical expenses. She recommended Michael Thompson, an attorney who specialized in personal injury cases involving family violence. Michael was aggressive and strategic, exactly what I needed. The preliminary hearings were brutal. Sarah's defense attorney, Daniel Green, was expensive and ruthless. He tried to get the charges reduced to reckless endangerment, arguing that Sarah hadn't intended to cause serious harm. The security footage destroyed that argument, but Daniel kept trying different angles. Maybe I'd gone into the basement willingly and locked myself in. Maybe I'd exaggerated my symptoms for attention. Maybe this was an elaborate scheme to frame Sarah out of jealousy. Each hearing required me to relive the trauma. I'd sit in the courtroom while attorneys argued about whether my sister had truly intended me harm or just made a terrible mistake. Eleanor attended every hearing, sitting behind Sarah's defense table, shooting me hateful looks. David sat on my side of the courtroom, his face gray and haunted. The trial took 8 months to begin. During that time, I moved my life completely out of Washington. Rosewood held too many memories, too much connection to a family I no longer claimed. I accepted a position with an architectural firm in Denver, 3,000 miles from Rosewood. Jessica helped me pack, made the cross-country drive with me, and stayed for 2 weeks to help me settle into my new apartment. Sarah's attorney tried every strategy available. Character witnesses testified about what a wonderful mother she was, how involved in her community, how this was completely out of character. The prosecution countered with my testimony and that of 3 childhood friends who described years of Sarah's cruelty toward me. One friend, Chloe, broke down on the stand, recounting how Sarah had pushed me into a frozen pond when I was 12, then told our parents I'd fallen in while showing off. Mark finalized his divorce halfway through the trial. He believed Sarah's version of events initially, but cross-examination had revealed details even he couldn't rationalize away. The premeditation was undeniable. Sarah had installed that deadbolt specifically for this purpose. She'd purchased it 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Receipts proved it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty of a gravely dangerous act with malicious intent. The judge sentenced Sarah to 12 years in prison, citing the extensive planning and the particularly cruel nature of leaving me to succumb to the cold. Eleanor collapsed in the courtroom, screaming about injustice. David sat stone-faced in the gallery, his expression unreadable. Mark was awarded full custody of the children. He moved them to Arizona, cutting off all contact with Eleanor. He sent me a letter months later, apologizing for not seeing who his wife really was, thanking me for potentially saving his kids from whatever she might have done to them eventually. The oldest daughter had started asking questions about why Emily never visited anymore. The truth would come out eventually, but Mark wanted to control that narrative. The children's therapy records became part of the civil case. Mark's attorney provided them with permission, wanting to demonstrate the full scope of harm Sarah had caused. The youngest child, only 4 years old during the incident, had witnessed some of Sarah's behavior in the days before Thanksgiving. She told her therapist about Mommy being angry at Emily, about Mommy saying mean things when Emily couldn't hear. The middle child remembered Sarah installing the deadbolt on the basement door, asking why they needed it. Sarah had said it was to keep monsters from coming upstairs. Those therapy records gutted me. Sarah had involved her children in this, made them witnesses to her deteriorating mental state before she acted. They'd sensed something was wrong with their mother but had no framework to understand what. Mark's decision to seek full custody wasn't just protective, it was essential. Who knows what Sarah might have done to them in a moment of anger or spite? The financial investigation revealed more disturbing details. Sarah had convinced me to take out a life insurance policy 3 years before the incident, claiming it was smart financial planning since we were both getting older. I'd signed the paperwork during a visit to Rosewood, trusting my sister's advice. What I didn't know was that she'd submitted a separate beneficiary designation form afterward, forging my signature to name herself instead of the charitable organization I'd intended. The insurance company had never sent me confirmation of the beneficiary details, a procedural failure that let Sarah's deception go undetected. $500,000, with her position to collect upon my demise. Michael Thompson subpoenaed those records and presented them during the civil trial. The jury's reaction was visceral. This wasn't a prank gone wrong or a momentary lapse in judgment. Sarah had been planning some kind of violence against me for years, setting up financial incentives for my end. The basement incident was just the execution of a long-term plan. Rachel Miller amended the criminal charges to include a gravely dangerous act with premeditation, which carried a much longer potential sentence. Eleanor's reaction to the insurance policy revelation was telling. She didn't express shock or horror that Sarah had forged my signature and planned my demise years in advance. Instead, she blamed me for being successful enough that Sarah felt desperate. If I hadn't gotten that promotion, hadn't moved to Seattle, hadn't built a career that made Sarah feel inadequate, none of this would have happened. My success had provoked Sarah into extreme actions. Therefore, I was partially responsible for her attempting to end my life. David filed for divorce the day after the insurance policy came to light. He'd been holding on to hope that maybe Sarah had just made a terrible, impulsive decision. The evidence of years of planning destroyed that hope. He hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in Rosewood and fought for every asset. Eleanor had enabled Sarah's violence through decades of favoritism and excuses. She created a difficult situation and then unleashed it on their younger daughter. David wanted nothing more to do with either of them. The divorce proceedings were vicious. Eleanor tried to claim emotional distress, arguing that David was abandoning her during the worst time of her life. David's attorney countered with evidence that Eleanor had known about Sarah's disturbing behavior for years and covered it up. There were emails between Eleanor and Sarah's old employers, Eleanor making excuses for incidents, Eleanor offering to pay for damages to avoid official reports. She'd been cleaning up Sarah's messes for decades. During this time, I started receiving anonymous letters at my new apartment in Denver. Hateful screeds blaming me for destroying my family, calling me vindictive and cruel. Handwriting analysis confirmed they were from Eleanor, who'd somehow obtained my new address. I filed a restraining order against her, too, which only deepened her fury. She told people at her church that I'd become so spiteful that I'd cut off my own mother from contacting me. The restraining order against Eleanor was harder to enforce than the one against Sarah. Eleanor never made direct threats, just sent passive-aggressive cards and letters expressing her disappointment in how I turned out. But the cumulative effect was harassment, and eventually a judge agreed. No contact with me, no attempts to obtain my contact information, no third-party messages. Eleanor violated it twice, resulting in fines and a stern warning that further violations would mean jail time. Chloe testified at the trial about the frozen pond incident from our childhood. She'd been there that day, 12 years old, watching in horror as Sarah pushed me through thin ice into freezing water. Sarah had stood on the bank laughing while Chloe ran for help. When our parents arrived, Sarah claimed I'd been showing off, skating too close to the weak ice despite warnings. Eleanor believed her immediately. David had looked uncertain but didn't contradict his wife. Chloe had carried guilt about that incident for 20 years. She should have told the truth, should have insisted that Sarah pushed me. But she was a child facing down two adults who clearly wanted to believe their eldest daughter. So, she stayed silent, and Sarah learned that she could harm me with impunity. Chloe wept on the witness stand, apologizing to me across the courtroom. Her testimony established a pattern of Sarah using cold as a means of harm against me, making the basement incident look less like an isolated event and more like an escalation of lifelong mistreatment. 2 other childhood friends came forward with similar stories. Ben remembered Sarah locking me in a freezer at a friend's house during a birthday party, claiming it was a game of hide-and-seek. I'd been 7 years old, trapped for 20 minutes before another child heard me screaming. Olivia described an incident at a summer camp where Sarah had taken my winter coat on the last day, forcing me to ride home in the unheated bus in October weather. The pattern was undeniable and chilling. Eleanor never spoke to me again. She sent one email 6 months after sentencing blaming me for destroying her family. I was vindictive, she wrote. Cruel. You'd always been jealous of Sarah's popularity, her beauty, her perfect family. This was your revenge for a lifetime of being second best. I deleted the message without responding. David reached out regularly. We had coffee whenever I visited Washington for work, which wasn't often. He'd sold the house in Rosewood, moved to a small condo in Seattle. Being in that house haunted him, he said. Every time he walked past the basement door, he heard my screams that he'd ignored because he believed his daughter's lie. The guilt consumed him. I started therapy in Denver. Dr. Alex Wu specialized in trauma recovery. Our sessions focused on rebuilding trust, processing betrayal, understanding that my family's dysfunction wasn't my fault or responsibility. It took 2 years before I could sleep through the night without nightmares about the cold. 3 years before I could go into basements without panic attacks. The settlement from the civil suit against Sarah provided some measure of justice. My attorney, Michael Thompson, argued that her actions had caused permanent physical disability and psychological damage. The jury awarded me $2 million, though collecting it proved difficult since Sarah had no substantial assets. Mark agreed to a payment plan from the marital estate, wanting to do what he could to make things right. I used some of that money to establish a foundation for victims of familial violence. Too many people suffer in silence because society expects families to stay together regardless of toxicity. My foundation, Second Chances Alliance, provides legal assistance, therapy resources, and emergency housing for people escaping dangerous family situations. We've helped over 300 people in 4 years. Dr. Reed became a close friend. She attended the foundation's launch event, gave a speech about recognizing signs of deliberate harm disguised as accidents. Her involvement brought credibility and media attention we couldn't have achieved otherwise. She admitted she'd almost missed the significance of my case initially, almost accepted the family's explanation that I'd wandered into the basement and gotten trapped accidentally. Something about the deadbolt installation nagged at her, though. She pushed for that police investigation despite pressure from hospital administrators worried about offending a prominent local family. 5 years after the trial, I met someone. His name was Noah, and he was a structural engineer I worked with on a major commercial project in Denver. He knew my history because my story had been covered extensively in national news. Thanksgiving basement ordeal, sister's dangerous act. The headlines were sensational, but they brought awareness to how family violence often gets overlooked or minimized. Noah never pressured me to reconcile with Eleanor or to forgive Sarah. He understood that some betrayals are unforgivable, that family doesn't automatically deserve access to your life. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony attended by David, Dr. Reed, Jessica, Chloe, and a handful of close friends I'd made in Denver. The family I'd chosen, not the one I'd been born into. Sarah was released from prison after serving 9 years with good behavior. I heard about it through David, who'd maintained minimal contact with her for the sake of closure. She'd written him letters from prison, never apologizing, but insisting she'd been misunderstood. The basement incident was a joke gone wrong. She'd meant to let me out after an hour, but got distracted. The security footage showing her testing the lock throughout the day? She was checking to make sure I couldn't escape and somehow harm myself in anger. The delusion was complete. She'd reconstructed the narrative in her mind, making herself the victim of my vindictiveness. Eleanor reinforced this version, visiting her weekly in prison, assuring her that I'd always been jealous and manipulative. They built an entire mythology around my supposed villainy, unable to confront the truth that Sarah had deliberately tried to end my life. I didn't attend the parole hearing. My victim impact statement was read aloud by the prosecutor, detailing how the attack had fundamentally altered my life, stolen my sense of safety, destroyed my family relationships. The parole board approved her release anyway, citing her clean prison record and completed rehabilitation programs. I wasn't surprised. The system often values the appearance of redemption over the reality of harm done. David warned me that Sarah might try to contact me. She'd made comments in letters about wanting to repair our relationship, to explain what really happened. I filed a restraining order immediately. No contact, direct or indirect. If she came within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace, she'd go back to prison for violating the order. She tested it once. 3 months after release, she showed up at my office building in Denver. Security recognized her from the photo I provided and called police before she could enter. She spent 48 hours in jail for the violation. The judge extended my restraining order to 10 years and warned her that any further contact would result in serious consequences. Eleanor called me after that incident. Her first direct contact in 6 years. She screamed into the phone about how cruel I was being, refusing to let Sarah apologize. I listened silently for 30 seconds, then said 4 words: "She tried to kill me." Eleanor sputtered, insisted I was exaggerating, claimed Sarah had explained everything. I hung up and blocked her number. David's health declined rapidly after that. The stress of maintaining relationships with both daughters while they refused to acknowledge each other had worn him down. He suffered a massive heart attack 8 months later, passing before the ambulance arrived. I flew to Washington for the funeral, my first time back in 4 years. Sarah attended with Eleanor. They sat in the front row, dressed in black, playing the role of grieving family members. I sat in the back with Noah, surrounded by friends David had made in Seattle. During the service, Eleanor gave a eulogy that painted David as a devoted father who'd loved both his daughters equally. She didn't mention the divorce or the reasons behind it. The burial was worse. Eleanor insisted that as the eldest daughter, Sarah should help her scatter some of David's ashes in his favorite fishing spot. I refused to participate in any ceremony that included Sarah. David's lawyer, Andrew Stone, pulled me aside afterward. My father had left a will that specifically addressed this situation. His estate was divided equally between his daughters, but Sarah's portion was placed in an irrevocable trust for her children, inaccessible to her. My portion came with a letter. I read it that night in my hotel room. David's handwriting, shaky from the heart condition that eventually took his life, covered 3 pages. He apologized for not protecting me, for believing Sarah's lies, for enabling Eleanor's favoritism. He explained how watching that security footage had destroyed his understanding of his family. He'd spent the last years of his life trying to make sense of how he'd raised a daughter capable of such a dangerous act. The letter ended with a request. He wanted me to forgive myself for surviving, for pressing charges, for refusing reconciliation. None of this was my fault. Sarah had made her choices. Eleanor had made hers. I deserved to live without guilt, to build a life filled with people who genuinely loved me. He was proud of the woman I'd become, despite everything his family had done to try and break me. I wept for hours. Noah held me, letting me grieve, not just for my father, but for the family I'd never really had. The fantasy of belonging somewhere, of being valued by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. That dream had perished in a freezing basement on Thanksgiving weekend, and I've been mourning it ever since. 10 years have passed since that night in the basement. I'm 42 now, living in Denver with Noah and our daughter, Lily. She's 6 years old, brilliant and kind, everything I hope she'll always be. We've built a life here that's full and rich, surrounded by genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The foundation has expanded to 12 cities, helping thousands of people escape toxic family situations. Dr. Reed serves on our board of directors, using her medical expertise to train emergency room staff in recognizing signs of familial violence. Jessica runs our Denver office, coordinating legal services for victims who need protection orders or custody arrangements. Sarah is somewhere in Nevada. Last I heard, she completed parole and moved away from Washington, perhaps recognizing that her reputation there was permanently damaged. Mark remarried, and his kids are thriving. The oldest daughter, now 19, reached out to me last year through social media. She wanted to know my side of the story, said her father had told her some of it, but she needed to hear it from me. We met for coffee in Dallas, where neither of us had history. I showed her the scars on my fingers and toes, the permanent reminders of what her mother did. Told her about the hours of screaming that nobody answered, the cold that nearly took my life, the realization that my family valued appearances over my survival. She cried, apologized for things that weren't her fault. Asked if we could stay in touch. We've built a relationship slowly, carefully. She's nothing like Sarah, thank goodness. She's studying social work, wants to help families in crisis. Lily adores her. Calls her cousin Madison. It's a small redemption, this connection across generational trauma. We're both choosing to be different from what we came from. Eleanor passed 2 years ago from complications of diabetes. She'd never managed her health properly, and the stress of Sarah's imprisonment had accelerated her decline. Sarah called to inform me, her first direct contact since the restraining order expired. Her voice was flat, emotionless. She said, "Mother had always hoped we'd reconcile before she died." I said that was unfortunate and ended the call. I didn't attend the funeral. Eleanor made her choices just as clearly as Sarah did. She chose favoritism over fairness, delusion over truth, enabling over accountability. The consequences of those choices were hers to bear. I'd spent enough years trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it fairly. The basement incident taught me something valuable about survival. Sometimes the people who harm us most are the ones who were supposed to protect us. Sometimes families are toxic systems that require escape rather than repair. Sometimes justice means walking away completely and building something better from nothing. I still think about that night occasionally. The cold, the fear, the crushing realization that nobody was coming to save me. But I also remember Dr. Reed's determination to uncover the truth, Detective Lewis's refusal to accept the family's lies, David's eventual courage in choosing justice over family loyalty. Those people saved my life in different ways, and I've tried to honor that by living fully and helping others do the same. Lily asks sometimes about her other grandmother, the one we never visit. I tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways. Some people make bad choices that hurt others. We don't have to maintain relationships with people who are dangerous, even if they're family. She seems to understand as much as a 6-year-old can. We're teaching her that she gets to choose who belongs in her life based on how they treat her. The Foundation's latest project is a documentary about familial violence survivors. My story is featured alongside dozens of others who've escaped dangerous relatives. We're hoping to change the cultural narrative that insists families must stay together regardless of toxicity. Blood relation doesn't grant unlimited access to harm people. Sarah sent a letter last month. It arrived at the Foundation's main office, forwarded to me with a warning from our security team. I debated reading it for days before finally opening the envelope. 3 pages of her handwriting detailing how prison changed her, how she found faith, how she finally understood the enormity of what she'd done. She wanted forgiveness, a chance to explain herself, permission to be part of my life again. I burned the letter in our fireplace. Noah asked if I felt better, and I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no lingering pain. Sarah had become irrelevant to my life. A cautionary tale I shared to help others rather than a wound that still bled. That realization felt like final freedom from the family that tried to destroy me. Dr. Reed says recovery isn't linear. Some days I still struggle with trust, with believing people when they say they care about me. Therapy continues, probably always will. But I've built a life worth living, filled with people who've proven their love through actions rather than words. That's more than I ever had growing up in that house in Rosewood. Lily will never spend Thanksgiving in a basement wondering if anyone cares enough to look for her. She'll never question whether her family values her survival. That cycle ends with me. The Foundation, the documentary, the relationships I built, they're all part of ensuring that what happened to me helps prevent it from happening to others. Sometimes justice is a prison sentence. Sometimes it's walking away and never looking back. Sometimes it's building something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to destroy you. I've done all 3, and I'd make the same choices again without hesitation. What's a difficult choice you've had to make to protect yourself or your loved ones?